In the 9th year of the 4th age, when the white tree in Minas Tirith had thrice shed its spring snow of blossoms, a letter of ash and iron was found in the archives below the citadel. Merrin of Lossernach, a quiet keeper of scrolls whose hands had more ink than callus, drew it from a chest with brass corners and a lock that had melted and flowed like wax. The letter stank of smoke, even after 1,000 washings of the stone with the cool breath of the mountain. He carried it to the lamplight, and the script upon it stirred like cinders in a grate. The hand was old, older than the fall of Barad-dûr, and it named a thing forged not for dominion, but for dread. A ring wrought in secret, of blackened mithril, and quenched in the blood-warm streams of Orodruin, the ring of the shadowed flame. It was said to hold, not power for the bearer, but a prisoner, bound and muffled, a thing that had once walked as fire in the deep places. The letter had a seal of a hammer and a star. A sign of Celebrimbor's house? Merrin whispered. Captain Anborn of Ithilien, returning on swift errand, read the ash letter at the steward's request. The house of the jewel smith bears many marks, he said gravely, but this was stamped by a hand that knew the torment of the enemy's eye and bit it back. There is counsel in this, dangerous and deep. Elisar, king of the reunited realm, was gone to Pelargir to see the rebuilding of the key, and the charge fell to Faramir, prince of Ithilien. He listened in dim noon with the shutters closed. Bring it to the Eldar, he said at last. If a prisoner of fire is truly bound within a ring, we must know the key and the lock. Merrin of the Archives, you shall bear it. Choose company, quiet feet, clear eyes. So Merrin, much against the counsel of his own knees and bone, took up a small pack, and with him went Barzi, son of Bori, a dwarf of Aeglarond who laughed like a struck anvil, and Lerwin of the Golden Wood, keen-eyed and silent as the still hour before snow. A fourth joined them at the causeway gates just before dawn, a tall man in a gray cloak whose face was grave and untroubled. Morian, a ranger of the north, thin as a spear shadow. I have seen signs along the greenway, Morian said, touching his brow. Storm prints without rain, ash on the grass. I think your letter walks before you like a rumor. They set out by the northway, under banners that the wind did not trouble, and the white city dwindled behind them like a bright thought half forgotten. They crossed the Morthond and the Ranglo, and slept in fir-scented hollows, and at each camp the letter lay between them like a banked coal. Lerwin would not touch it. Barzi touched it twice, and wiped his fingers on the earth with an oath. Morian never touched it at all. Merrin alone kept it near his heart, more for duty than desire, and he dreamed of stairways where the treads were tongues of flame turned inside out. On the 5th night, riders passed them without sound, rangers of Arnor, pale-eyed and courteous, who nodded to Morian as to a hearth-brother. He nodded back, but did not speak. We are north of their watch, he said after they had gone, yet they ride to the east. Wolves will follow men more readily than deer. Wolves? Barzi grunted. I have seen no print. You will, said Morian, and the firelight made cavern his face. They came at last to the Bruinen, wide and quick, and the broken house of Elrond still held song in its stone. Glorfindel met them at the arch and smiled, though his eyes went to the sealed letter at once. He led them to the Hall of Fire, where a brazier glowed with steady warmth that did not burn, and there Lerwin spoke first, in the clear speech of the Eldar. Lord, she said, we bear an old peril in a new skin. Glorfindel studied the ash letter long. A prison forged as a ring, he said softly, not unknown in the elder days. To bind what cannot be slain is the craft of despair or wisdom. Which is this? Merrin told all, and when he was done, Glorfindel laid the letter upon a slab of green stone. This seal is not Celebrimbor's alone, he murmured. It bears the bruise of another hammer, the mark of Narvi of Khazad-dûm, who wrought the doors of Moria. Elf, maid, and dwarf sealed, and quenched in fire that should not have quenched. For Orodruin gives birth to power, not prison. Then what lies within? Barzi asked. A shadow that once wore flame, Glorfindel replied. Not Sauron, He is unbodied, not a dragon. Those are proud and will not be bound. But there were others, older and obedient. And when they fell into darkness like sparks into sea. If this letter speaks true, one such spark was cupped and hooded. Lerwin's voice was low. Durin's bane? Kin to it, perhaps, said Glorfindel, or a tattered shred that yet remembers heat. He folded his hand. You must go to 2 places, to the Golden Wood, for there remains lore of binding and unbinding in the keeping of the lady's folk, and to the deeps of Khazad-dûm, for there is where flame bred shadow, and shadow drank flame. Take counsel from both, and go softly. Morian bowed. We will go first to Caras Galadon. Not by the Red Horn, Glorfindel warned. The mountain wakes sometimes in its sleep. Take the western road and cross the Silverlode low. That night, in Rivendell's last long dusk, Merrin dreamed of a crown of fire inverted like a cup, with darkness gathered beneath it, like wine. The eaves of Lorien were somber in late summer, the leaves like green glass holding back the sun. They were met by wardens with white bows and soft shoes, and brought under the high bole to where Fletz still held memory of song. Rumor said the lady had departed, yet the air clung to the tongue sweet and perilous. In a circle of carved roots, the keeper of the mirror, Nimwen, stern and gray-eyed, received them. You carry a foundry's sin, she said without greeting. Set it down and let it lie still. Merrin obeyed, and the letter seemed to flinch at the touch of the grass. Nimwen had them look into the mirror, though the day was bright. Water lay there smooth as hammered silver. Upon it flickered images of deep vaults that breathed, forging halls without hammers, and a glow like heart fire caught beneath a cloak. The water steamed once and was calm. Nimwen straightened. Shadowed flame is flame that has learned to fear. Long ago, when the world was younger, some among the Valorokr were hunted and unmade, not all utterly. One, perhaps a captain lesser than the bane that slew Durin, was broken, and a fragment fled. An elf of Eregion and a dwarf of Khazad-dûm, perceiving that the ember might flare again if left to wander, contrived to confine it. To destroy fire entirely is the business of the sea, not of hand and art. So they forged a ring as a hooded coal scuttle is set over a dying brand. In it, the ember sleeps, smothered by shadow drawn from the emptiest hollows beneath the earth. Then we should destroy the ring, Barzy said at once. Cast it once more into Orodruin, as was done with the ruling ring. Nimwen's mouth thinned. Destroy? Perhaps. To break a prison is also to break its law. If its captive is not first diminished to naught, the freed thing will be what it was, with hunger added. Merrin felt the letter's weight, like a hand on his breast. How then may the ember be quenched? By an opposite, Nimwen said. It was shadow that muffled fire. Seek a light that gives no heat. There are few such in Middle-earth. Lerwin spoke after a space. There is the starlight that sleeps in Keled Zaram, Mirrormere at Durin's doors. It is cold, and it is true. Nimwen inclined her head. Dwarf and elf forged the prison. Dwarf and elf must unbind it. Yet there is a path through darkness before you reach that cold star. Through Moria, Barzy said, voice like a door shut softly. And there, Nimwen added, gaze turning landward, you will be hunted by ash-footed wolves. A will attends your road that thinks itself your guide. Morian's eyes were quiet as winter rivers. Then we will outthink it, he said gently. They left Lorien as red drifted into the green, and the Silverlode ran beside them like a bright, untroubled thought. The west gate of Khazad-dûm stood in shadow where once the Siranin had laughed. The water was gone to the far deeps, leaving black slime and the buried bones of a watchtower's dream. Barzy walked before them, feet sure, eyes mild with an old ache. Lerwin traced the faint silver of Ithildin with her fingers, and the letters answered, shy as moths. Enin Durin, Aran Moria, Pedo Melon Amino. Friend, said Merrin aloud. The doors stirred like breath in sleep, and with a soft complaint of stone that did not care to be disturbed, they opened. Inside waited old night, not the hateful dark of caves that deny the sky, but the great sleep of the mountain itself, where time settles like very fine dust. Their lights threw back at them 1,000 eyes of quartz and 1,000 more of memory. Dwarf ways ran hard and straight, then multiplied into vaults and snows of pillars. The company's steps were small upon those floors. They camped above the 7th hall, where the roof came down like a forest on a winter noon. Barzee sang low after meat, a forge song that set Merrin's teeth to humming and made Lerwin's eyes soften. Morian did not sing. He watched the dark as one listens for a forgotten name. On the 2nd day, they passed a chasm whose breath was cold and smelled of broken stone. On the 3rd, they came to the chamber where once a book had burned, and the last of a company had stood against a shadow with wings. Merrin bowed his head without knowing why, and Barzee touched the floor with the back of his hand. Lerwin's voice was scarcely more than thought. "Here, hope and loss were braided," she said. "Do not tarry," Morian urged, and his voice moved in the air like a warmed knife. They found Mirrormere not with their feet, but with their ears, by the thin, sibilant murmur of water as it drinks itself. The dwarf road descended to a cavern lit by its own faint star glow. The lake lay as smooth and black as a closed eye. Barzee went to the lip and knelt, and his breath made rings that moved and did not break the surface. Here, Durin looked and saw a crown of stars above his head. He whispered, "Here, too, we must look for a colder crown." They stood together and drew forth the ash letter. Its seal had warmed against Merrin's chest as they descended, and now it was soft as new wax. Lerwin opened it carefully. The script shifted, then steadied. "Bind the ring with star-cold light. Thrice and once more," it read. "Speak the names of the two that forged and the one that broke." "Celebrimbor," Lerwin said. "Narvi," Barzee said. "And who broke?" Merrin asked. Morian stepped forward. "Speak the nameless," he said softly, for it was not a name, but a shattering. "Call it unmaking." They held the letter over the lake. The light there rose not to burn, but to know. 4 times Lerwin and Barzee let it bathe the ash script. 4 times the letters looked as if they might take flight and vanish. When they withdrew the sheet, the seal had cooled to iron. "Now the prison may be opened," Morian said, and then quenched utterly. "Opened," Merrin echoed. "For to extinguish a smothered ember, you must give it first the air to gasp, so that it may be drowned. Else it hides, and keeps its red eye under the cinder forever." Lerwin frowned. "This is perilous counsel." Morian smiled without mirth. "All true counsel has peril in it." They bound the letter again and turned their steps south, for there was one more place to which all such roads led, the Mountain of Fire, where prisons and crowns alike had been unmade. They climbed from the dim into the vast bowl of the world. The sky was clear as a bell. Barzee breathed wide as if to drink it. Lerwin narrowed her eyes, for light after long dark stabs, the sight. Merrin's shadow walked beside him like a companion who had learned his stride. They crossed the celebrant near its birth and angled west of Fangorn, whose old trees still muttered in a language too slow for men. In the ruin of Isengard, hawks nested, and Orthanc stood like a tooth in a healed gum. They bivouacked in the courts, where once a wizard had plotted, and Meren slept poorly, dreaming of a circle of stone and a fire cupped in hands too white. They came among the herds of the Mark and were given meat and milk by riders who remembered Gondor's banners on their wind. "Beware the Emyn Muil," one rider said, thumbing southward. "The hills breed fogs even in summer, and there are holes there that never see day." Morian thanked him and led them by a goat track little used. Twice they saw ash on green grass. Once they smelled sulfur in a hollow where no spring ran. "You said wolves would follow men," Barzee said to Morian that night. "I have heard no pads, only my own boots." Morian poked at the fire. "There are wolves that do not pad," he said quietly, "and some that are not wolves." Merrin thought of the ember under the hood and tried to make his thoughts silent. The land beyond the Ethel Duath lay like an old bruise under a healing skin. Grass crept even onto parts of Gorgoroth, though the wheat there would never be good. and the wind smelled faintly of pans that had boiled over. A few hardy folk had built stone bothies where once great engines were, and their children looked at strangers without fear and with a little anger, for all strangers had once worn black here. Orodruin was quiet, a squat giant sleeping with one eye cracked. The path to the Samath Naur was unguarded, and yet not empty. The mountain watches its own. They climbed in thin air, and sweat stung their eyes. The mouth of the crack yawned before them, the chamber where the one ring had ended, and the world had taken a long breath. There, in the heatless wind, Morian bade them halt. "Here," he said, "here we open the prison. Speak again the names in their order, and set the seal in the mountain's breath." Lerwin's hand went to the hilt of her knife. "I mistrust this hour. The mountain hungers for closure," Barzi muttered, "yet it still eats." Merrin took the letter. "Celebrimbor," he said. A faint tremor passed through the stone. "Narvi," said Barzi, and the air wavered like heat over rock. "Unmaking," Lerwin whispered, unwilling but compelled, and the ash letter cracked like frost. Morian lifted his hands, and for the first time Merrin saw that the palms bore fine scars, arranged in a circle. "And now," Morian breathed, "come forth." The seal broke. There was no blaze, no roar, only a sound like a sigh exhaled by a smith after long toil. Something unseen stepped out, and the chamber grew colder as if a fire had been drawn away. Merrin's heart lurched. Lerwin's breath fogged an instant. Barzi swore, soft and reverent, as dwarves do in the holiest places. "Bind it," Morian said. "Hold it between you. Do not fear." Lerwin and Barzi, by some knowledge older than their feud, raised their hands as if catching a weight of nothing. Their fingers met and did not touch, and between them the air became heavy. Merrin saw a faint stain, like smoke against smoke. "Now," Morian said, voice bright like the strike of steel on steel, "now cast it down. Let the mountain drink the last of its kind." Lerwin's eyes narrowed. No, the council was cold water and star, not fire, not this. Morian smiled faintly. "The council was mine." The strain between elf and dwarf grew. Merrin felt his knee drop to the stone and forced himself upright. "Morian," he said hoarsely, "who are you?" Morian's face, always still, became perfectly calm. "A guide," he said. "A watcher. A prisoner that learned patience." Lerwin's hand opened. Barzi's closed. Between their fingers the stain quivered like a moth. Morian took a step nearer the crack and spread his arms as if to welcome the dawn. "Release me," he said, and for an instant the veil of man lay thin over him. A heat shimmered, not burning, but remembering. Merrin saw, in the tremble of air, a shape with long arms like spears and a back that folded shadow as birds fold wing. Not the great enemy, nor one of his nine, but a lesser dread, a captain without crown, a Balrog's remnant, thinned to a hunger and a will. The world tilted. The plot that had walked beside them from Minas Tirith stood uncloaked. "Hold!" Merrin cried. "Hold! And away from the fire!" Morian, no longer Morian, laughed without sound. "You have brought me home," he said gently. "Faithful are the deceived." He reached for the invisible burden, and the chamber flared with cold. Lerwin sprang as one of her kind do, swift as river light, and struck Morian's wrist with the back of her knife hand. The knot wind that clothed him tore like old silk. Barzi snarled and pivoted his weight as a gate turns. He bore the unseen ember away from the cracked step by grinding step, his boots screaming on the rock. The mountain woke, not as in the dark year, no thunder of lava, no choking storm, but a low warning, like a sleeper turning to his other side. Dust shook from the ceiling in moon-pale veil. "Down!" Merrin gasped. "Down and out!" They fled through heatless haze. Morian did not pursue. He stood in the center of the chamber with his head bowed, listening, perhaps, to some memory of drum. When at last he stirred, he moved not like a man, but like rising smoke, and the mountains seemed to lean toward him. They ran until rock gave way to steep dirt, until the broad flats of Gorgoroth opened like a gray sea, and even then did not stop, for fear has a long stride. They came at last to a cleft, where a thin stream limped, and there they fell. "By Durin's beard!" Barzy panted, eyes bright and fevered. "He would have had us break the lid and snuff the lamp in the same breath. The spark would leap higher, not die." Lerwin's face was pale as chalk. "He wore your trust like a cloak," she said to Meryn, not unkindly. "Do not be ashamed. Even the wise were deceived by fair forms in Eldred." Meryn stared at his hands. "He knew every turn of the road before we took it, because he walked it long ago." Lerwin said quietly, "In other skin, we must turn his road against him." Barzy looked south, where the mountain crouched. "Star-cold light," he murmured. "We must return to the Mirrormere." "To Moria, then," Meryn said, and a small part of his heart rejoiced at the word return, for going toward darkness is one thing, going away from it is another. "But he will not let us go north untroubled. He cannot walk far from that which binds him," Lerwin said, "yet far enough to strike at our heels." They rose, and they went in turns, silent and speaking, and the ash letter lay like a dead thing in Meryn's pack. Its words had done their work. Across the black flats and the brown downs they trod, and sometimes in the morning a film of ash lay on Lerwin's hair, as if night had tried to plant a banner there. Twice Barzy heard a rattle like beads behind them, and turned to see only air that did not quite match the rest. Once Meryn woke to find his blanket damp and smelling faintly of old coal. None of these things slowed them, for time has its own weather. In Ithilien, under beeches that whispered green tongues, rangers gave them bread and standing side glances. Meryn said nothing of Morian. Shame and wrath together keep words down. The road bent west and then north, a familiar ribbon used for unfamiliar haste. At the Redhorn Gate, wind struck them with a handful of ice. Lerwin smiled at last and sang a little, for the high airs please her kind. Barzy walked with his head tilted, as if listening to the bones of the world. "He comes," the dwarf said once, and then, after a dozen steps, "He waits. He has learned patience," Meryn said bitterly. "He has learned hunger," Lerwin answered. "Hunger feeds patience." They found old wolf traps on the downs, rusted, cunning things from the days when Saruman's orcs had hunted to fill kettles, and these they turned into alarms behind them. Once in the night, a trap chimed, and a low sound like a chuckle answered it from nowhere. Lerwin doused their fire with one swift breath. "Keep the ember between us," she said. "What we carry is a lamp that would rather be a sword." They descended again into the western shadows of the mountains of mist, and Moria's hollow calling rose to meet them, like a forgotten song remembered all at once, so that the heart aches. The west gate opened again to the word friend, and for a moment Meryn thought it mockery that such a small syllable could swing so much stone twice in 1 year. But friendship is old as rock, and the door remembered. Their return to the Mirrormere was not triumphant. They moved like thieves in a sleeping city. Barzy led them to a ledge where the water stood nearer to hand, and there Lerwin set her palms over the invisible ember, as if to shelter a child from too bright sun. 4 times and no more, she said. 4, as were the seasons of Durin's crown. Meryn drew the ember toward the lake. The surface dimpled without wind, as if breath sighed from the other side of the water. He felt rather than saw a thinness grow between what they held and what slept beneath. "First," Lerwin whispered, and they lowered it. The Mirrormere's light, cold as moon on snow, passed through and around, and made the unseen stain visible at last. A thread of dusk twined with a thread of banked flame. It writhed like a fish that has forgotten the sea. "Second," Barzy breathed, voice steady. The thread thinned. "Third," said Lerwin, closing her eyes. The thread dimmed. Meryn felt a pressure ease against his ribs, as when a long grief cracks and runs. "Fourth," said Barzy. They lowered it, and the Mirrormere flashed, sudden and terrible, with a light that was not reflected but given. The cold of stars made water. The embers screamed. They heard it only as a shiver in the teeth and an ache in the palm. It leaped from their hands and fled into the lake like a spark into rain. Silence folded. The cavern breathed. "It is done," Meryn said too quickly, as men do when they fear a work may yet be undone by words. Lerwin opened her eyes. "It is not yet done," she said. "What sleeps may dream. What dreams may wake. We have quenched it, but we have not sealed it." Barzy nodded slowly. "There is a gate below, older than our doors. I have seen its like, a mithril lattice that may be drawn as a net. It was for fish of light and songs that sink." Merrin shuddered. "Will it hold a dream? It will hold a river," Barzy said, and grinned, fierce and tired. "And dreams do not swim well against rivers. They set to work with dwarf tools, hidden where only dwarves think to hide them, in the grain of pillars, in the hollows of steps. Morian, if he came, did not come in flesh, but sometimes a cool breath touched the back of Merrin's neck, and once he saw, in the water, a shape like a man drowning from the inside out. They drew the mithril net, singing in harsh whispers, as dwarves do when they pull against ancient things. It came up shining with a light that belonged to no fire. Lerwin touched it and did not flinch. "Seal," she said. They sank it and drew it taut until the lake's quiet was a tautness also. The Mirrormere darkened, becoming once more a black eye with a cold star set deep within. "Now," Barzy said, "let us be gone." They left Moria under a wind that smelled of rain. On the long slope toward the Dimrill Dale, Lerwin paused. "He comes," she said, and this time her voice held no question. "From the south?" Merrin asked. "From all directions," she answered, "like cold fire blown thin." They did not run. You cannot run from a wind. They walked with their cloaks close, eyes narrow, and hands light on their weapons. The valley seemed to grow longer, as if years had been set between one step and the next. On a shelf of rock they halted, for the shapes in the air had grown not thicker, but hungrier. Morian came out of that hunger, as a man might rise from a warm bed and regret it. He was as before, and not as before. His eyes, once mild, were now honest, empty as a quenched brand. "You were cunning," he said with grave courtesy, "elf and dwarf and man, braided with a thread of book dust. You turned the old enemy of your houses into a rope." Lerwin's mouth was proud. "We turned it into a lock." Morian inclined his head. "And yet locks rust. I have long patient. I have longer hunger." "Star cold water is patient also," Barzy said, "and stone is the longest of us." Morian moved a hand, and for an instant Merrin felt heat on his face, heat that did not warm. "I ask no more deceit," the Knot-Man said. "Give me back the prison. I will walk into the mountain and never trouble your high trees and your white towers. Your children will grow old in unburned summers." Merrin surprised himself by laughing once, a single bark. "You will never trouble us again because you will be busy? No, friend, we are learned enough to recognize a promise that breaks itself." Morian sighed. "Then take a last gift." He turned his palm up. Upon it lay a ring of blackened mithril, dull as charcoal. "You carried its letter, and you never asked where the ring itself lay." Lerwin's eyes widened a fraction. Barzy's lips thinned. Merrin felt shame curdle with anger and become resolve. Morian offered the ring to the air between them. "If you cast this into the Mirrormere, the net will slacken. The ember will have a door. If you cast it into the fire, the prison will break, and I will unwrap myself. Choose the light you trust." Barzy hefted his hammer and did not speak. Lerwin reached for an arrow that was not for flesh, but for fate. Merrin did the only thing he, who was not elf, nor dwarf, nor warrior born, could do. He stepped forward, empty-handed. "Neither," he said, and his voice shook but held. "A prison for a prison, a ring for a ring." He held up his right hand. On it was no jewel, only a plain band of steel such as archivists wear to keep their pages from tearing, a habit from long hours. "You bound yourself in counsel and in deception," he said to Morian. "Bind yourself in promise also. Swear by all the names you have forgotten that you will not pass the net we wove, nor stir the lake, nor trouble the stone with dream." Morian watched him. For a long time wind moved around them, and the only sound was water too far to see. "Words," Morian said at last, amused and almost kind. "You set words against hunger. Maren swallowed. Words changed the world when the world was sung into being, and words have undone kings. Swear, because there is a part of you that remembers fire's pride, and pride would keep an oath even against itself. Something like surprise touched the ash of Morian's face. He lifted the black ring as if it were a cup, and his mouth shaped syllable that had not been spoken in the Fourth Age. Lerwin's eyes widened, for she heard the high tongue of the West, made strange by older echo. Barzi's head bowed a fraction, for the cadence had the measure of a forge-lit vow. "I swear," said Morian, "by the first name I burned, and the last name I wore. I swear by the shadow of fire, and the fire of shadow. I swear by the mountain that made me and the river that broke me. I will pass no gate of Mithril. I will stir no dream beneath a star-crowned water. I will trouble no stone." He put the ring to his lips. Smoke slipped from his mouth, thin and bloodless. He closed his hand. When he opened it, the ring was ash. Then he bowed to Meren. "You have taken from me what I would not have given to a king," he said. "A bond." He thinned, he faded, he was gone, and the valley lay empty, as if nothing had ever breathed there but wind. They did not trust to oaths alone. Oaths are ropes, ropes fray. They returned once more to the Mirrormere, and Barzi worked for 3 days without sleep, drawing and knotting mithril with a patience that made Lerwin's heart ache. Meren, who knew nothing of nets, brewed broth and spoke soft words, when dwarf hands bled, and dwarf pride pretended not to notice. Lerwin went down in a wicker boat where only elves can balance, carrying with her pebbles that the moon had kissed. At the lake's navel, she set the pebbles in a ring and spoke a name that trees sometimes say to stars. The water took the name and laid it deep. When she rose, Meren saw pale arcs moving under the surface, like the ghost of a crown. Barzi hauled once more and sang to the lattice, and when he stopped, the cavern was so still that Meren felt his own breath, a discourtesy. "It is done," Barzi said, and this time no one argued. They stood together at the gate and looked upon the Mirrormere long, until their faces were pale coins cast upon its palm. In its black, the white stars of Durin burned without heat, and between those points there seemed to coil a shadow that could not rise. Lerwin touched the water and smiled. "The smallest of things. Sleep," she said to what lay below. "Dream of snow." They turned their feet toward the west gate for the last time. Autumn walked beside them into Gondor. At Amon Hen, the wind smelled only of leaves. At Edoras, the mounds were green and gold, and a child danced on the grass where once horse lords had wept. In Ithilien, the bees still tasted time. Meren found he could laugh again without having to remember how. They came to Minas Tirith as the first snows not of weather, but of blossom began to loosen from the white tree. Faramir received them in the Hall of Suns. Elisar returned the next day from Pelargir, and when Meren knelt, the king raised him at once. "You have lines in your face that were not there," the king said gently. "There were old things to look at, Lord," Meren replied, and his smile was crooked. Barzi told the tale in dwarf fashion, spare and iron-bound. Lerwin spoke like water over smooth stone, and her words carried the shape beneath. Meren spoke last, and he said little, for it is the work of archivists to keep and not to gild. When all was told, the king stood long at the window and watched the mountain, a smudge on the horizon that would always be a smudge. "This will not make song," he said at last, surprising them. "It is too quiet for the lay singers, but it will make peace." Faramir's eyes shone. Peace needs small hands as well as bright swords. They went out under the white tree, and its petals fell like a soft snow on their cloaks. Meren lifted his face and closed his eyes. Lerwin turned to him. "There is a road that runs beyond the Grey Havens," she said, half smiling. "Not for us, not yet, but I think the sea has heard of what you did, and approved." Barzi snorted and clapped Meren on the shoulder hard enough to hurt. "If the sea wants to thank us, it can send better beer upriver." They laughed then, all three, and the laughter did not echo like fear, but settled into the stone as something it would remember. That night, Meren dreamt again of a crown of fire turned like a cup to hold darkness. But the cup was full of cold water, and in the water, a single white tree bent to drink. And far away, in halls of green stone beneath the mountains of mist, a lake slept without dream, and a hunger slept also, bound not only by mithril and water and the deep will of stone, but by a thing it had not thought to fear, a promise spoken in the clear tongue of the waking world. And if, on certain winter nights, when the stars burned sharp as whetted knives, a breath like a sigh rose from Moria, it troubled no one's sleep, for it was the sound of something remembering how to be quiet. Epilogue. The long quiet years are like the clear beads on a child's cord. Each seems small while held, yet the string grows long in the turning of the hand. So the fourth age slipped forward, and a story that had burned like a coal in the chambers of the world cooled and sank into the bedrock of memory. In the waning of a late autumn, when gulls drifted above Peligir, as the Anduin tasted its own salt, Meren of Losarnak climbed again the high stairs of the Citadel archives. The lamps there were globes of pale glass, and their light fell upon corridors that smelled of vellum and cedar oil. His limp had grown friendlier, a companion that matched his pace without complaint. He no longer wore the plain steel band that had shone on his hand the day of the oath, for he had hammered it flat himself and pressed it into the cover of a book, on the binding of things that should not be unbound. The title was his, but the truth belonged to others. He set the book upon a shelf where the shade of Isildur's scrolls kept company with the songs of kings. For a long while he stood with his palm resting on the spine, as men sometimes rest a hand on a good plow after harvest. Words, he murmured, recalling a valley wind and an empty-eyed guide. Words, whole, words, bite. Then he closed the case and sealed it with the sign of the steward. And when the wax cooled, he breathed out, as one who had held in a breath for a mile and a half. That night, he walked the quiet streets of Minas Tirith and came at last to the court of the fountain. The white tree stood slender and still, its limbs holding the ache of winter with gentleness. A single petal loosed itself and fell, not to sorrow, but to rest. And Meren remembered the last dream he had spoken to no one, a tree bending to drink. Sleep, he told the tree, though it did not need his counsel. All good growing rises from good sleeping. The stars above the mountain's line were fierce and tender at once, like eyes that have wept enough tears to see clearly. In the morning, messengers left by swift paths. One went south and then west, bearing a folded letter for the glittering caves, where Gimli, son of Glóin, still made the halls forget they had once been merely stone. The letter carried news that would please a dwarf, that the mithril lattice in the deeps of Khazad-dûm held strong, and the Mirror dreamed of crowns without throats to scorch. Another messenger took the road to Emin Arnon, for Faramir would wish to know that the long watch in the north had grown shorter by one hunger. Barzi himself bore no letter. He came. In the first blush of spring, he strode under the white tower's shadow, leaner and browner, with the curl of hammer smiles still at the corner of his mouth. He had traveled from Aglarond, where he had taught 3 apprentices how to listen to stone before striking it, and had taught himself to drink a little slower and speak a little soft. When he found Meren in the Hall of Records, he embraced him as dwarves do, briefly and with a thump that carried more love than caution. "You look like a book left open in the sun," Barzi said, squinting. "Drying well. Try not to curl. And you look like a door that refuses to warp." Meren answered, "Well hung." They laughed in that old way that sets worry at a distance where it can no longer hear itself. Lerwin of the Golden Wood came later, not by road, but by rumor, as the Eldar do. The city noticed her as water notices starlight, something that is always there when night is clear. She bore no bow. She bore a small harp of yew whose strings had been washed in the Nimrodal. In the king's hall she sang once more of the two trees, and those who knew that song from the lips of none since the elder days did not cry aloud. They simply leaned toward the sound, as flowers lean toward light they had not expected. Afterwards, she walked with Merrin upon the walls and looked south, where the line of the Eiffel Dueth was a bruise on the far sky. "The long patience holds," she said. "It holds because three kinds laid their pride down where it would catch no wind," Merrin replied. Lerwen turned her bright gaze upon him. "Do not make pride of humility," she warned, but her smile was not unkind. Word of a vow has a way of drawing other vows into daylight, and soon there were oaths spoken in places not used to oath. In Lossernach, farmers set their hands upon cool earth and swore not to salt their furrows in anger. On the Pelennor, boys who had cut practice sticks from the wrong hedges went to the gardeners and confessed, and the gardener, knowing the cost of saplings, asked only that the boys learn the names of the trees before cutting them next, and the boys did. In the houses of healing, a woman whose child had died of fever took her grief to the courtyard and said, "I will not be unkind to the living, because the dead did not obey me." The stones held that vow, and for a season the hospital smelled more of rosemary than bitterness. It was said that if you stood at sunset on the 7th step of the northern stair and counted backward all the names you had ever been called in anger, the wind would carry the last of them away. Merrin tried it once when the city slept. He found there were fewer names than he feared. He found, too, that the wind returns what one should keep. "Archivist," it whispered. "Friend," he kept those. As for Morian, if that was ever a name and not a borrowed coat, the world did not see him again as a man. Mariners out of Dol Amroth, whose eyes have long practice at looking where water speaks, swore that on certain blue mornings the air above the bay trembled, as if with heat, though spring was still cool. They would lower their voices and say, "There is a fire somewhere that is learning how to be still." Shepherds upon the Morthand sometimes woke to find a faint warmth along the stones of their fold, as if a traveler had pressed a palm there in the night, then thought better of it. And above all, in the deep deeps of the mountains of mist, the Mirrormere kept a darkness that never rose, as a sealed letter keeps its contents even after the hand that wrote it is dust. At whiles Merrin dreamt not of crowns or cups, but of a forge without fire, where a smith hammered with gentleness that made the iron ring sweeter than music. In the dream, the smith had no face, and when Merrin asked his name, the blow fell silent, and he woke with the taste of snow on his tongue. He told no one of this save Barzi, who grunted and said, "Not all smiths are born to heat, some are born to measure." Afterwards Merrin walked his days with a rightness that needed little watching. King Elisar came often to the archives in those years. He spoke little when he came. He would sit with Faramir and Merrin and read the chronicles of ordinary folk, a mason's account of the river wall repairs, a boatman's list of rents on a poor stretch of bank, the notes of a midwife who had kept record of every first cry she had heard, and of the last breath of those who had never learned to cry. "These are the rings I choose to wear," the king said once, closing the midwife's book with reverence. "Circles of days completed." Faramir replied, "Then let us forge more, and break fewer." Sometimes Lerwen's harp could be heard in the houses of Lore, playing a melody that had no center and therefore could not be lost. A boy who had stolen a silver clasp to give it to a girl returned it upon hearing that tune. He confessed, and Merrin, who sat with him on the cool flags, told him the story of a man who had been two shapes at once and had chosen the thinner of the two rather than break a word. "Why?" the boy asked, not scornful, only young. "Because an oath is a bridge," Merrin said, "and to break one is to learn forever the taste of falling." News of the Mirrormere's long quiet went by many channels to many ears. In Erin Lasgalen, Thranduil's folk took the tale and wove it into a new dance for midwinter, one that began with a tangle of red cloaks and ended with white scarves laid upon the floor, as if snow had decided to be merciful. In the Blue Mountains, smiths told their apprentices that water can be harder than steel under the right moon. And in the Shire, where tails climb fences more easily than cats, there appeared a song called "The Ring That Wasn't for Wearing," light as beer foam and as shrewd as a farmer's eye. No one who heard it ever again mistook possession for purpose. Gandalf was gone into the west, and with him much high counsel. Yet Middle-earth learned a humbler wisdom, one that fits more comfortably in common hands. The men of Lebanon wrote new laws in a plainer tongue so that folk might keep them without being beaten first by ink. In Rohan, a young marshal listened to old women at the well and altered the grazing routes for the sake of the smallest herds. "Hunger is an ember," he told the king, "best to smother it with plenty before it finds breath." Even Umbar, troublesome as ever, sent a quiet embassy with a small, sharp queen at its head, who asked dryly whether Gondor intended to net all its lakes with dwarf silver. "Only the ones that dream badly," Elisar said, and she laughed, and a war that might have been did not trouble the world that year. One evening, near midsummer, Lerwin asked Meryn and Barzy to walk with her as far as the Harlan, where the river lay broad, and the ships of Dol Amroth wore swans that seemed almost tempted to leave their prows. They went in the last light, which had a habit of laying gold where it was not needed and making it beautiful anyway. On the quay, a small fire burned for fishers, and a child slept with her head in her mother's lap, while the mother stitched a net, of rope, not of mithril, yet the pattern pleased the eye in the same way, strong crossings that made a field where nothing cruel could fall through. Lerwin stood looking upriver. "I will go soon," she said. Barzy set his boot on a bollard and drew a line in the dust with his heel. "West?" he asked. She inclined her head. "The call grows. It is a sound without sound, and I have delayed long enough." Meryn felt a gratitude that tasted of fresh water and a sorrow with the same taste. "Will you go by the havens?" "By the long path," she answered. "I will walk where the Nimrodal used to run, and I will sleep where she spoke soft to the fern roots, and when I reach the sea, I will be full of the voices I have loved. It is meet to cross singing." Barzy said, "If you see the master smith beyond the sunset, tell him that iron is still iron and dwarves are still stubborn." "I will tell him," Lerwin promised, "and I will say that men have learned to bind with their tongues instead of their hands, which is a subtler and sometimes a braver work." They watched a barge take the current, and the current take the barge. The child woke and asked for a story. The mother began the one about a king who hid his name in his pocket and found it there only when he needed it least. Meryn smiled and thought that was a good story, and wished to read it when it had been written. They said farewell without noise. Lerwin took the north way, glittering for a time like a thread of light fallen among hedges, and then she was gone. And if Meryn's eyes stung, it was the river's doing. The years stepped on. Faramir grew more spare of word and more full of action. The gardens of Ithilien became a school where plants taught rulers to be patient, and rulers learned. Elisar sat sometimes upon the lowest stair of the king's house and spoke with bakers, and if the dough rose well the next day, the bakers told no one whose counsel had occasioned that risening. The White Company, riding home by the west road after a distant mission, paused before the moorland turning and decided, without orders, to take the longer path that ran by a nameless lake. They camped there and slept without dream. And in the morning, every horse drank with a stillness seldom seen in war steed. In time, Meryn's hair kept more silver than black, and he liked it that way. He took one apprentice, a girl who counted silence as a necessary binding in both music and speech. He taught her the catalogue, but also the softer art of weighing what should be written and what should be kept in the mouth until it melted and flavored living instead of parchment. "A world cannot be saved in pages," he told her, "though a page can save a world's moment." She wrote that down, and then, on second thought, folded the note into a boat and floated it upon the fountain. On a winter's night thick with stars, Meryn climbed again to the archives and drew out the book whose cover bore a flattened ring. He read his own plain word and found them sufficient. At the end of the book, there was a blank page. He dipped a pen, hesitated, and at last wrote, "The oath hold, the net hold, the water hold. We hold when we remember." He sanded the ink, shut the cover, and looked toward the north where stone and silence keep their counsel. For a little while he felt, as clearly as one feels a weight in the hand, the presence of a will vast and thinned, standing upon the far lip of a lake and listening, not to escape, not to rage, but to the long patience into which it had sworn itself. Then the feeling passed, as all great feelings do, and he was only a man in a library with a cooling lamp and the soft sound of the city in sleep. When spring returned once more and the tree shed its small, bright snow, Barzee came to Gondor for the last time. He and Merrin walked beyond the Ramazekor to a field where boys were flying kites shaped like swallows. The line hummed in their hands. "There's a forge under every good sky," Barzee said. "You only need the wind to pull the bellows, and the will to use it for mending," Merrin answered. "Just so," said the dwarf. He pressed a small weight into Merrin's palm, a token of mithril worked into a knot like a net, so fine that light seemed to hesitate among its strands. "If ever a dream grows teeth in your house," Barzee said, "hang this above the door. It will remind the teeth they are only rain." Merrin laughed and embraced him. They parted upon the road like two rivers that had run alongside each other, longer than geography intended, and each went on singing. The world has many endings and few finales. The shadowed flame remained shadowed. The mirror kept its crown without a head beneath it. Children were born who would never fear wings in a hall of stone. And if sometimes a traveler woke near the Dimrill Dale to the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was keeping a promise, with all the stubbornness the world could spare, the traveler rolled over, smiled into the cloak, and slept again. Thus, the tale comes not to a breaking, but to a binding, of water to star, of stone to silence, of oath to hunger, and of hearts to the quiet work that outlasts any trumpet. The age turned and would turn again, and in the turning, the ring that was not for wearing held fast, the ember that was not for burning, and above them both stood a small sentence, written in the plain hand of a man who loved pages and peace. "Be still and be true."